Hey, my name is Eli Stanchfield. I'm 63 years old, and I farm corn on a bend of the White River, 3 miles down the water from a town called Cane Bluff, Arkansas, on bottom ground my grandfather cleared with a mule and a grubbing hoe after he walked home from the war between the states. It isn't much by anybody's measure. A gray plank house set back on the rise where the high water has never yet reached. A deep porch across the front of it, looking down the slope to the river. A corn crib of hewed oak logs older than I am. A smokehouse. A garden patch. A mule named Homer who holds opinions. 1 good milk cow. A dozen hens. A cypress skiff my father built that had gone so leaky at the seams these last years that I bailed her more than I rode her, and a landing at the foot of the path, built on oak pilings my father drove the summer he was young, where the packet boat used to put off salt and coffee in my mother's day, and where mostly nothing puts off at all anymore. And on the corner post of my porch there hangs a railroad lantern with a red glass in it, and that lantern is the beginning and the middle and the end of everything I have to tell you, so I had better tell you about it first. My wife Nan hung that lantern on the corner post the year our boy Tom got old enough to run the river after dark, out past supper with his trot lines and his John boat. And she lit it every evening at dusk so that whatever the night did to the water, there would be one red light on the bend that meant home, and Tom could steer by it. He steered by it for years. I used to stand at the window and watch it find him, a little smudge of boat coming up the dark river, correcting toward that red light like it was being pulled on a string. Then the war came across the ocean, and Tom went to it the way the strong ones went. And in the fall of 1918, a telegram came up the road from Cane Bluff, and after that there was no boy out on the dark water to steer by anything. Nan lit the lantern every single evening just the same. 8 more years she lit it, and I never once asked her why, because I knew why. And then her heart quit her in the garden between the bean rows on a soft June morning, and since that morning I have lit it myself. 11 years now, every dusk. Rain or clear or ice. Habit, I'd have called it, if anybody had asked. But nobody asked. Because there was nobody left to ask. A man who has buried his whole family keeps doing the small things they loved, because the small things are what's left. If you had told me 2 autumns back that feeding a boatload of hungry strangers cornbread and side meat off my own table and asking them nothing, not one single question, would bring 40 lanterns up the dark spring water to my drowned landing in a line, like the stars had come loose of the sky and taken to the river, I would have said grief had finally turned my head. But that is exactly the way it happened, and every word of what I am going to tell you is the way it happened. People in Cane Bluff mostly call me the old man at the bend. They aren't unkind about it, most of them just done with me, the way a town gets done with a man who stopped coming in for anything but trading. After Nan passed, I let the church suppers go, and then the store porch talk, and then everything but trading day, and a man who only comes to town for nails and flour and salt gets talked about more than talked to. And then there was the matter of the bend itself. My landing sits on the best water for 10 miles in either direction. The river runs deep against my bank at every stage. The shape of the bend shelters it from ice and running drift, and the bottom will take a piling and hold it like a jealous hand, while the town's own waterfront up at Cane Bluff has been silting and caving for 20 years, till the packet has to feel her way in soft. Grover Pell, who owns the Mercantile and the Cotton Gin and about half of whatever else in Cane Bluff is worth owning, had put together what he called the Cane Bluff Landing Company, and twice he had come down my road in his buggy to offer me money for my bend. $200 the last time, Twice I told him no, polite as I knew how, because my father drove those pilings and my folks are buried on that rise, and there is no figure a man can write on a check for that. Pell took it the way big men take a no from a little one, smiling with just the front of his face. "The river's going to take that bend off you for free one of these springs, old man," he said, climbing back up into his buggy, "and you'll wish to God you'd sold." I said the river, and I had an understanding. That was a foolish thing to say, because no man has an understanding with a river. You have manners with it, is all. My grandfather taught my father that, and my father taught me. You take what the water gives, you give back what you can, you keep your landing lit of a night, and you never ever laugh at a soul the river has been hard on, because it has not finished being hard on you. Cane Bluff had forgot that last part, if it ever knew it. That October, the town council passed a brand new ordinance, number 44, and nailed it to the dock piling where everybody could read it. No shantyboat, houseboat, or floating dwelling shall tie up or anchor within the corporate limits of Cane Bluff, day or night. $5 fine. Boats to be moved along by the marshal. There had been shantyboat people on the White River my whole life. Boat people, drifting folk, fishermen and net menders and trappers and tinkers and boatwrights, whole families raised on the water in little scow-hulled cabin boats, working down the river in the fall and back up in the spring. And the ones I had known in my life were as decent as any people walking the ground, and some of them a good deal better. But the hard times had put more boats on the water than usual, and towns all down the river had commenced passing those ordinances one after another, like a sickness traveling, and Cane Bluff did want so bad to be as modern as anybody. I read that notice on the dock, piling one trading day with a sack of flour on my shoulder, and Grover Pell stood up on his store step watching me read it in his good coat, and he laughed and he said the thing I want you to remember, because this whole story swings on it the way a gate swings on a hinge. "About time somebody cleaned the river trash off this water," he said, good and loud, for the whole porch to hear. "If they won't live on land like decent Christians, they can drift on down and be somebody else's vermin." And the men on the porch laughed with him. Not all of them, but enough. I stood there with my flour on my shoulder, and I did not say one thing, and I have been sorry about it every day since. And I have come to believe that everything that happened after was the river's way of giving one old man his chance to answer proper. I put my flour in the wagon, and I drove home, and I lit the lantern. That was a Tuesday. The shantyboat came down to my bend on the Thursday evening, and it came the way trouble and blessing both come to a riverman out of the upstream dark, riding low and quiet. It was a raw evening for October. Wind out of the north, with spitting rain sideways in it, the river running cold and the color of an old axe head, and I was out on the porch with my collar up, having just lit the lantern, when I heard a sound I knew from 50 years back. The knock of a sweep oar working in wooden tholes, slow and tired, and not quitting. Then she came around the upper point, a shantyboat, riding deep. 30 foot or so of scow hull with a cabin built on her, weathered gray as a dove, washing strung under the eaves and taken in wet. A cold stovepipe with no smoke to it, which on a raw October evening tells you everything you need to know about what a family has got left to burn, and one lantern of their own burning low and yellow back by the sweep, where a man leaned into the oar with the particular patience of somebody who has been leaning into it a long, long time. And across the water I heard a baby crying, thin crying, worn out crying, the kind that has gone on so long it is more habit than hope, and any man who has ever walked a floor at 2 a.m. with a sick child on his shoulder knows that sound in his spine. The boat wasn't holding the channel. She was crabbing over toward my side, hunting the bend, and I understood in one look what the man on that sweep was doing. He was hunting slack water and something solid to tie to before full dark caught him on a strange reach, and there was a snag off my upper landing. A whole drowned cottonwood the September rise had planted root first in the mud, that he could not see and I could. So I did the only thing there was to do, which is generally how the biggest doors of a life swing open. I took the red lantern off the corner post, and I went down the path to the landing at a trot, old knees and all, and I stood out on the end of my father's pilings, and I swung that light slow and wide, the old way, the come in on this light way, and I heard the sweep bite harder, and I called across the water, snag off your bow, drop down another 40 foot, land below the light. And a woman's voice came back across the dark, clear and level and worn thin. Like a good tool that has been used hard, we see you, mister, coming down. That is how the Tolliver family came to my landing, though I didn't know their name yet, nor what the man of them was, nor what one supper was about to set moving up and down 3 rivers. You never do know the size of a thing while your hands are still doing it. The SCO came down the last 40 feet as easy as walking, and I caught the headline the boy threw me and took my turns around the piling head, and the man on the sweep laid her flank against my landing timbers as soft as you would lay a sleeping child into its bed, and that told me, before I ever saw his face straight on, that whatever else this man might be, he was a boatman down to the marrow of his bones. Up close in the ring of our 2 lanterns, I got my look at them. The man was 40 or thereabouts, built like a wedge, dark hair going iron gray, under a shapeless felt hat, with the biggest, most deliberate hands I ever saw on a human being, hands that hung quiet at his sides the way good tools hang on a wall. His face did his talking for him, and I would learn the why of that soon enough, which was that the diphtheria had near killed him as a boy, and had burned his voice out of his throat on its way past, so that all he had left of speech was a whisper like a dry corn husk, and he spent that whisper about as free as Grover Pell spent charity. The woman was younger, worn thin the way that autumn had worn a lot of river people thin, her hair tied back plain, a man's canvas coat over her dress, and a baby done up in a piece of quilt against her chest. There was a boy, near grown but not grown, all wrists and elbows and watchfulness, already moving around the deck, coiling wet lines without anybody telling him to, and a girl behind him with a solemn round face under a knit cap, and back inside the doorway an old woman stood wrapped in a blanket, straight-backed as a church pew, looking me over like she was pricing my soul for a trade. 6 of them. And one look over that boat in lantern light told me the rest of the ledger. The woodpile on the foredeck was down to bark and chips. The meal barrel by the cabin door stood with its lid off, and the inside of that barrel was shining. And a meal barrel only shines when it has been scraped. Cold stove. Wet washing. Sick baby. North wind. The woman spoke first, and her voice had that evenness that costs a person something to keep. "Mister," she said, "we're obliged for the light, and we'll be gone at first light. We don't ask a thing of you but the tie-up. There's a town 3 mile up that made it good and clear what's thought of boat folk on this water, and if this landing thinks the same, say it plain, and we'll drop on down in the dark. Only the chart talks about snags below here, and my children are wore out." I stood there with the red lantern in my hand, and I will tell you exactly what went through me, because it is the hinge of this whole story. It was not pity. Pity is a coin you toss down to somebody beneath you. What went through me was Nan's voice, plain as if she had been standing on the path behind me in her apron, a voice I had not heard in 11 years, saying a thing she said 40 years back. Some evening, with Tom's supper warming on the stove ledge and a strange John boat hailing our light. Eli, nobody ties up hungry at a lit landing. Not at ours. That went through me, and along behind it came the plain arithmetic of a scraped meal barrel, a cold stovepipe, and that thin, worn-down crying. This landing doesn't think the same, I said, and nobody is dropping down through a snag field in the dark tonight. Tie her double and bring your family up to the house. There's a fire, and there's supper, such as it is. The woman looked at me a long moment, rain ticking on the lantern glass between us, and the man came forward and stood beside her, and something passed between the two of them without one word said out loud, the way it passes between married folks who have been poor together a long time. Then she said, "We can't pay." "I know it," I said. I didn't ask. They came up the path in a line, the boy carrying the girl on his back the last stretch because her shoes had more mouth than soul. And I built the fire up in the kitchen stove till the lids glowed, and I did what a widower learns to do or starves not doing. I put cornbread on in Nan's big iron skillet, and side meat in the second skillet, and I set out sorghum and a crock of dried apples I stewed soft with sugar, and I went out through the rain and milked the cow an hour early so there would be sweet milk warm for the children and the baby. And then I watched a hungry family eat, which is a thing that will rearrange a man. The children ate quiet and steady, not grabbing, the way hungry children eat when they have been taught not to shame their raising, and the old woman ate slow with her eyes closing between bites, and the woman fed the baby milk off a spoon, drop by patient drop, before she took one bite for herself. The man would not sit at first. He stood by the door with his hat in his hand until I said, "There's no chair in this house anybody has to earn." And even then he ate standing, and afterward he carried a plate down through the rain to eat the second half on his own deck, because a boatman of his raising does not leave his boat unwatched the first night at a strange tie-up. Over supper the woman gave me their names, offering them careful, one at a time. Ora Tolliver, her man, Ansel, the boy, Judd, the girl, Pearl, the old woman, was Ansel's aunt, and everybody on 3 Rivers called her Aunt Dicey. And the baby, the little one working at her spoon of milk with her whole tired heart, was Mercy. I gave them mine, and that was the whole of what I asked, and I want that wrote plain, because it matters to everything after. I did not ask where they came from. I did not ask what put them on the water in a killing month with a scraped barrel. I did not ask how long they meant to stay or when they'd go. A man at my table is not a prisoner giving testimony. Nan taught me that too. But Ora told me some of it anyway, of her own accord, with her spoon set down, in a voice she kept flat on purpose the way you carry a full bucket level. They had tied up at Cane Bluff at noon that same day, she said, meaning to trade. They had $2.10, and the $2 was for meal and side meat, and the dime was for croup syrup, because Mercy had been croupy for a week and worse at night. Ansel had his tools out on the deck besides, because a town that size always has a skiff wanting caulking or a dock plank sprung, and they aimed to trade work, not beg. They never got the length of the store aisle. The marshal met them at the dock with the paper and read it at them. The whole ordinance, $5 fine, moved along by dark. And Ora had stood on the town dock with the baby coughing against her shoulder and asked, not for the tie-up, just to be let to spend their $2 in the store before they went, cash money across the counter. And the storekeeper had come out on his step and looked at her, and looked at the baby, and said loud, for the dockmen to hear. "We don't trade with river trash." And the dockmen laughed, and two of them threw the Tolliver's lines off the cleats while she was still standing on the dock, so that Ansel had to bring the boat against the current to take his own family off the planks of a town dock at dusk, in spitting rain, with a sick baby, and not one soul on that waterfront said one word against it. She told it level, and when she was done she looked at me straight and said, "I don't tell you that for pity, mister. I tell it so you know what you tied to your landing tonight, in case you want to think better of your supper." "I have thought about it," I said. "Eat your apples." The old woman, Aunt Dicey, laughed one dry syllable at that. The first sound she'd made all evening, and after that the kitchen eased. When the children had been fed to the eyebrows and Pearl had gone glassy-eyed over her plate, I lit a lamp and took Ora down the hall and opened the door on Tom's old room, which I had aired every spring and never once used. With the bed made under a quilt Nan pieced the winter before the telegram, and I said, "The women and children sleep warm tonight, and the door bolts on the inside if it eases you." Ora stood in that doorway a moment reading the room, the way river people read water, and she put her hand flat on the door frame, gentle, like you'd touch a gravestone, and said only, "Thank you." And later, passing down the hall, I saw through the cracked door children asleep in that bed, 3 of them crossways in a heap like puppies, and I had to go stand out on the porch a while in the cold until I got my breathing put back the way it belongs. Now here is the part I have told at more suppers since than I can count, and I ask you to hear it the way it was said, plain as a body reads out a land deed. Before Ora turned in, she came back to the kitchen where I was banking the stove, and she stood herself square, and she said, "Mr.
Stanchfield, I'll say one thing more tonight so it's said and heard and you can't ever claim you wasn't told. On this river, a shared table is a debt. Boat folk don't have banks and we don't have deeds, but we keep books all the same. And no boat family on 3 rivers dies owing a supper debt. You set meat in front of my children at a lit landing, and you asked us nothing."
Not our name, not our trouble, not our leaving day. That is wrote down now, wrote where no flood can reach it, and it draws interest. You won't understand what I'm telling you tonight, and that's all right. One day you will. I told her supper wasn't a debt. It was just supper, and she shook her head once, the way you do at a child who is wrong in a harmless way. And she said, "Not at a lit landing it ain't. It's been said now. That's all I owe you tonight," the saying. And from the corner, half asleep in the rocker with her blanket to her chin, old Aunt Dicey spoke to nobody in particular, and what she said was, "The saying is the seed. The rest comes up with the water." I went to bed that night in a house that had people breathing in it for the first time in 11 years, and I lay there listening to the rain quit, and along toward the smallest hours I heard, or half heard, or dreamed I heard, a sound down at the landing. A soft, patient tapping, muffled, like a woodpecker working in fog, tap, 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 unhurried, and once faint as a memory, the long bright ring of iron. I thought, let him be. A man's dignity does its business at its own hours, and I went to sleep. In the morning I was up before light, the way 63 years of cows and corn will fix a man, and I took my coffee down the path in the gray, and I stopped dead on my own landing with the cup halfway to my mouth. My skiff, my father's leaky old cypress skiff, that I had bailed every morning for 5 years the way other men wind a clock, was sitting on the water beside the shantyboat, floating high, floating light, floating dry, the way a sick man sits up easy when the fever finally leaves him. Ansel Tolliver was sitting on the landing planks beside her in the cold dawn, with his caulking box shut at his knee and his big hands hanging loose, and he watched me come and take it in. Every dead seam in her had been raked out clean and new oakum spun in and driven home, the seams paid smooth. The sprung strake amidships backed with a butt block fitted so sweet you'd have said it grew there. A new oak knee let in under the after thwart where the old one had gone punky, and the hood ends drawn back tight to the stem with copper nails clenched over roves, every head of them lined up like a hand of cards. That was the tapping I had heard, a caulking mallet muffled in a rag so as not to wake the house that fed him. He had done it alone, in the dark, by feel and by lantern, and done it better than the boatyard at Duval's Bluff could have in a week of Sundays. The boy Judd came up the landing about then, with the bale bucket in his hand, turned upside down, empty, grinning like Christmas, and he said, "Pa don't sleep the first night at a strange tie-up nohow, mister. So he give the night to your skiff. He's a boatwright." Fifth one down, back to his great-great-granddaddy on the Ohio. Boats is what Tollivers are. I ran my hand down that stem like you'd stroke a horse, and I had to clear my throat twice before it would work, and I said, "This boat was my father's. I've bailed her every morning for 5 years, and I'd have paid a yard good money to do what you did, if I'd had it." And Ansel Tolliver stood up and he laid one of those big, deliberate hands flat on her gunwale, and he spent some of that ruined voice of his, which I already knew was not a thing he did for just anybody, and what he whispered, dry as husks and plain as daylight, was good wood, worth saving. And then he took up his caulking box and went to see about his own boat, and I stood on my father's landing in the gray morning with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I looked at that dry old skiff riding the water like a duck, and I want to tell you, whatever it was that had been sitting on my chest for 11 years, right about then it shifted its weight. They meant to drop on down that morning, but the north wind stood up mean, and the baby was still croupy, and I said running a sick baby down a cold river to spite a calendar was foolishness, and the wind could have its say first. Ora said, "Then we work our keep, or we go," and she meant it, so they worked it, and those next 4 days were the fullest that farm had been since Tom was alive. Ansel and Judd rehung my crib door that had sagged on its hinge since Coolidge, and built new steps down the landing bank, and Ora took over my kitchen so complete that by the second evening I couldn't have told you where my own salt was, and I did not care, because I had forgot what a house smells like when somebody is baking in it. You can dust grief out of a house, but you cannot scrub it out, and it turns out the only thing that truly moves it is bread. Pearl named every one of my hens by the second day and stood in the yard doing formal introductions. Aunt Dicey held the porch rocker like a judge holds a bench, shelling my late beans and telling river stories older than the county. And it was Aunt Dicey who told me a thing I have thought about every evening since. "Used to be lights all down these rivers," she said. "Farm folk that set a lamp out where the water could see it, and a table behind the lamp. Boat people called such a place a supper light, and we passed the word of them, mother to daughter, mile by mile 3 rivers over. Wasn't charity and wasn't trade. It was just the old manners of the water. Ain't but a few supper lights left now," she said, and she looked at my red lantern and then at me, and didn't say anything more, and didn't need to. The baby mended in the warm, sleeping longer each night, and by the 4th night, Mercy slept dark to daylight, and Ora came out to the porch when the children were down and stood a while and didn't talk, which is its own kind of talk. And Ansel walked my place. I'd catch him at it, standing at the lip of my bank, where the field edge broke off to the water, prodding the ground with an iron rod, pacing off the distance from the crib to the high water stain on the smokehouse stones, And on the last evening he stood whispering into Aura's ear a long while, and she came and gave it to me straight. Ansel says your bank's been undercut 10 year, she said. Says the river changed her set when the railroad cut the timber upstream, and she's been eating under you ever since. Quiet the way she does. Says the next big rise takes your landing and that corn crib both, and half the bank field with them, and says the crib sits a foot too low for a bad year besides. I told her the crib had stood since before the war between the states, and she said, Ansel says nothing stands before the water, things stand until. He gives it one more spring, maybe two if you're lucky. I knew he was right, is the worst of it. I'd watched that bank calve off a wagon width in 10 years, and I'd priced pilings and labor at the boatyard once, and the figure was $700, which for me might as well have been $7,000. So I had done what men do with a debt they can't pay, which is look away from it. The morning of the 5th day broke still and blue, and they loaded to go, and I did the one piece of commerce of that visit, which was to carry down 2 fat sacks of shelled corn from my crib, and a side of meat from my smokehouse, and a crock of Nan's apple butter I had been saving 4 years for no reason a living man could name, and set them on the shantyboat deck. Aura squared up to argue, and I got there first. It's freight, I said, not charity. You're carrying word downriver for me. There's a snagged cottonwood off my upper point. Tell the boats. She looked at me a long moment with those level eyes, and something in her face let go by about a 1/4 inch, which on Aura Tolliver was a whole speech, and she said, We'll tell the boats, Mr. Eli, believe that we will. And I gave Judd the bone-handled pocket knife that had ridden in another boy's pocket on this same water, and told him it wanted to be used and not saved, and the boy went still and old for a second, the way they do when they understand a thing all at once, and put it away careful, and shook my hand like a man. Then Ansel took the sweep, and the scow slid off my bend into the current as quiet as she'd come, and Aura called back the last of it across the widening water. You light that lantern of a night, Mist, Eli. It's a known light now, and boat folk pass word faster than the mail ever learned to. I lit it that night feeling like a fool, one old man hanging a lamp for an empty river, and inside of a week I learned what she meant. A John boat hailed out of the dark, lights burning, asking was this Stanchfield's and could 2 net men buy cornmeal, and they wouldn't take it free but traded a mess of catfish, and we ate together on the porch. That whole winter it went so. Boats in 1s and 2s, dropping down before the ice, hailing the red light polite as churchgoers, some just calling a good evening from the channel, some tying up a night out of weather. Nobody begged and nobody was turned off, and things took to appearing on my landing planks of a morning. Split stove wood, ranked neat. A blue catfish cleaned on a forked stick. A cane of sorghum. A corn shelling peg carved out of dogwood that fit my hand like it had been measured, which I expect it had been. I quit eating supper, standing over the stove like a man feeding a boiler, and took to setting the table again. 2 plates as often as not. Town caught wind of it, the way towns do. At the store that January, buying nails, I heard a dockman say, not quiet, that the old man at the bend was running a hotel for river rats now. And Grover Pell looked up from his ledger and smiled that front of the face smile and said, Mind your title deed, Stanchfield, because come spring my company drives a new town dock, and once the trade's fixed up here, that bend of yours won't be worth the mud it's sinking in. I bought my nails and went home and lit the lantern, and then came the spring, and the rain, and I will tell the flood part straight and quick, because I lived it slow, and once was enough. It set in raining, the last week of March, away up on the headwaters first, then over us. And it did not quit for 9 days. The river came up a foot a night, then 2. Then she left her banks altogether and stood in the bottoms like something that had always owned the place and had just come home. I did not sit and watch. I had 3 days of warning in the water's manners, and I used all 3. 12 sacks of seed corn up the stairs to the house loft. The hens crated and stacked on the porch. The cow and Homer walked back to the ridge lot on high ground and penned with feed. Tools up, harness up, smokehouse emptied up. And my father's skiff, Ansel's skiff now as I thought of her, hauled clean up the rise and double lashed to the porch posts, because Aunt Dicey's voice was in my head saying the rest comes up with the water. The crest came in the black middle of the night, the way it likes to, and I stood on my porch with the lantern lit and listened to my place go. The landing went first, the pilings my father drove groaning one at a time and letting go like old teeth out of a jaw, then a sound I will hear till they bury me, a crack and a long slide, and a boom of water, and 1.5 acres of my best bank field went off in one piece, standing dead furrows and all, and took the smokehouse foundation with it. And then the corn crib, my grandfather's crib, hewed oak, older than me, was undercut at the footings, and she leaned, and hung there a moment like she was asking, and then she went off her stones whole and rode away down the flood in my lantern light like an ark with nobody aboard, 40 bushel of feed corn in her belly, and around the lower point, and gone. The house held. My grandfather built on the rise for a reason, and I stood on his reason all night in the rain and watched 100 years of my family's mornings float off my place. When the water fell out of the bottoms a week later, what it left was a raw clay bite where my bank had been, 2 leaning pilings where a landing had been, no crib, no smokehouse, fences gone flat and strung with drift, and a bottom field with a hide of gray mud over it. It left me my house, my stock, my seed, and 1 dry skiff. Riding Homer up to town for flour and nails, I got the rest of what it left me. The dock men were on Pell's porch, the town front having taken its own beating, and when I came up the street one of them called out, "Well, if it ain't the man with the understanding with the river." And they laughed, and another one said, "Reckon the river trash can pull you around town now, old man," and they laughed harder. And Grover Pell came out on his step, in his good coat, with the crowd he wanted, and he said it slow so it would carry, the way he'd said river trash on that same step in October. "Face it, Stanchfield, the river's done what I couldn't. You're finished down there, finished at last. I'll give you $80 for the mud, out of Christian charity, and you can come die in town like a civilized man." And I stood in the street and I said the only whole thing I had, which was, my folks are still on that rise, and my lantern is still on its post. And I bought my flour and rode home, and I will not lie to you about that ride. It was the longest 3 miles of my 63 years. That first evening back I lit the lantern out of pure spite. The second evening I lit it out of habit that had wore through to the bone. And the third evening, I am not ashamed to tell it now, I stood on my porch at dusk with the match dead in my fingers, looking down at the wreck of a landing nobody could land at. And I said out loud, to nobody, to the river, what is a landing light with no landing? And that is exactly when I heard it. Away down the dark water, faint and steady and coming on. The knock of sweeps in wooden tholes. Not 1 boat's worth, not 5 boats' worth. More sweeps than I had ever heard working the White River at one time in my whole long life, all of them keeping time like one slow heart, all of them coming upstream. I struck 2 matches, ruining them before the third one lit that lantern, and I hung it on the corner post with my hands shaking, and I went part way down the mud path in the dark, and around the lower point came a light. Then 2 behind it. Then 5. Then a line of them, bead after bead after bead, shantyboats and skiffs and John boats strung up the black water like a rosary somebody had laid down on the river, every one of them carrying a lantern on a staff or a cabin roof, every one of them working upstream against a flood-fat current, sweeps and poles and oars all keeping that one slow time. I stood in the dark on my ruined bank and counted them the way a boy counts geese, and I had to start over twice, and the number I got, both times, was 40. 40 lanterns rowing upstream to me. The first boat in was the one I knew, and the boy Judd came over her bow with the headline before she touched, and made fast to the 2 leaning pilings I had left, and Ora Tolliver stood up on the foredeck with the lantern light on her face. And what she said across the water was, "Told you it was wrote down, mister." "Eli," I said, "what is this?" And my voice did not do well, and Ora said, "This is Tolliver's and Duke's and Vance's and Carmody's and half the boat kin off the White, the Black, and the Far Ohio. You fed 6 boat folk at a lit landing and asked nothing. And that word went up and down 3 rivers by Christmas. When word came the flood had taken the supper light at Stanchfield's Bend, boats commenced dropping their lines the same evening. Some of these rowed 100-mile upstream to stand here. Now go get your mule in the harness, because this ain't a show." What happened over the next 3 days I could talk about for 3 more. So I'll give it to you the way the river gave it to me. All at once. By first light my bend was a boatyard. Rafts of good drift timber the flood itself had brought down were snaked ashore with block and tackle, and Homer earning his corn. 2 scows lashed abeam grew sheer legs and a drop hammer, and 16 new white oak pilings went down into that bottom that holds like a jealous hand, and I heard the hammer keeping time with my own heart. Boys cut green willow all day, and the old men wove it into mattresses the size of barn doors, and sank them along my caved bank, weighted with stone off the gravel bar. The same trick the government engineers use on the big river, done here by barefoot boys with pocket knives. A landing rose on the pilings, 60 foot of it, decked and adzed, twice the landing my father's was. A new corn crib went up on black locust posts, sills notched and pegged, set a full 2 foot above the mark of the 19 and 13 rise, with shakes rived on the spot. And Aunt Dicey ran the kitchen boat like a colonel and fed better than 90 souls off it 3 times a day. Some of that being my own corn come home. And all 3 days, under a tarp on the biggest boat, Ansel and 2 of his brothers were at some work nobody was let to see, mallets going half the night. The 3rd evening they called all hands to the new landing and pulled the tarp, and there she sat, a ferry skiff, 18 foot of new cypress, copper-fastened, oak knees, a hull you could have read scripture off of, the like of which no store ever sold, and painted across her transom in a steady hand was my name, Eli Stanchfield, and under my name, smaller, 2 words, paid in full. Ansel Tolliver took my hand, and that whole landing went church quiet, because everybody on it knew what his voice cost him, and he spent it, loud enough for all of them, dry as husks. Good wood, he said, worth saving. And I stood on that landing in front of 100 people and wept like a well pump, and not one soul laughed. Grover Pell had been on the river road both days watching, and the 3rd evening he came down my path alone, on foot, hat in his hand, and stood at my porch steps with boat folk all around, and gave it up plain. "I called these people river trash off my doorstep," he said, and I laughed doing it. "I priced your landing at $700 and 8 weeks, And I stood on that road and watched them do it in 3 days, better than my money could buy, for the price of a supper. I was wrong, Eli, about them and about you, and I've come to say it where they can hear it. Then he asked, because the flood had wrecked the town front worse than ever, whether the packet might work my bend till Cane Bluff was rebuilt, and I said that wasn't mine alone to answer anymore. Ask them. And Ora Tolliver named the price off the foredeck without standing up. Strike your ordinance. Thursday next, Pell stood up before his own council and moved that ordinance number 44 be struck entire, and it carried without one no, and the marshal himself pried the notice off the dock piling. The town hired boat rights at a fair wage to drive its new front, so the same hands Cane Bluff ran off at dusk built the dock its trade stands on today, and Pell ate at the kitchen boat with the rest, and I am told he said thank you. And a case of croup syrup came down to my landing from the mercantile with a note that said, for whatever boat ever needs it, no charge. That was 2 years ago this spring. The corn made fine on that bottom mud. The ferry skiff earns her keep at a dime a crossing, first boat wage of my life. And the Tollivers tie up at the bend every fall for a month. Judd near a man now, running trot lines with a bone-handled knife, Pearl still holding formal introductions with the hens, and little Mercy toddling my porch boards calling me Pawpaw Eli, which I have quit correcting. Last June, Ora and Ansel had a new baby, born on the boat, a boy. They named him Eli. Nobody asked my leave, and I never got one word said out loud the whole day I heard it. And the lantern. The pilots and the boat people have a name for my red light now, all down 3 rivers. They call it the Stanchfield Light. And when the water turns mean, every boat on this river knows there is one bend where the bank will hold, the bottom will take your line, and the table is set. So here is the whole of what an old man knows, learned late, told from a porch at dusk. A light on a post and a seat at a table are the 2 cheapest things a man can set out, and the only 2 the dark has never once beat. You don't feed folks to be paid back. You feed them because somebody's baby is crying thin out on the cold water and you have cornbread. But nothing set out in kindness at a lit landing is ever lost. The river carries it, and the river forgets nothing it carries, and some drowned spring when you are standing in the wreck of everything with a dead match in your fingers, the water that took it all will bring it back up the dark, 40 lanterns strong, rowing against the current, with your name on the transom and paid in full underneath. It's dusk now. The lantern's lit, and away down the water, faint and easy, a voice is hailing the bend, lights burning. It always will be.